Evening, everyone. Welcome to ANU, and a special welcome to our online panelists and also our online audience. So at the moment, we've got 600 people registered online, as well as the people in the room. So it's fantastic to see all of the faces in real life, as well as to see those people who are joining us here today. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on who we meet. That's the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge their continuing and major contribution to the life of Australia. So today we're here to hear about the IPCC mitigation report and what this might mean for Australia and the world. And we've got a panel of fantastic speakers, all of who were intimately involved in the development of this report. So we've got a Vice Chair, Andy Reisinger, and we've got lead authors with Frank Jotzo, Xuemei, Tommy Wiedmann, and Jacqueline Peel. And I'll introduce each of those briefly before they get to speak. So we particularly want to note that this event is co-hosted with the University of Melbourne Climate Futures Group, of who Jackie is the director. And we look forward to continuing events and activities with Jackie's group there and with other universities across Australia. And just before I start the event, I just want to draw people's attention to our very recently published highlights, essentially our annual report for ICEDs here at ANU. And so this has been put together by Michelle Mossfield and colleagues, and is a very sort of short but readable summary of the things that we're doing on climate, energy and disasters here at ANU. So I recommend grab a copy on the way out if you haven't got one already. So just at the way we're running this, we're going to have some very brief introductory statements by each of the panelists, followed by essentially a set of questions engaging those panelists, and then Q&A with the audience. In that Q&A, we're going to be running off the VVOX program. So I don't know if you've got instructions to show on the screen there, but VVOX is an application. We've used this previously. So you just type in VVOX.app into your internet browser on your mobile phone, and here's the instructions. And you put in that meeting ID, which will come up in the right place, or you can take a photo of the picture there, the QR code, and then you can write in your own questions and you can vote up other people's questions. So the importance of that is that we actually get questions from both the online audience and the face-to-face audience, and we can select the ones which are most popular, that most people want answered by the panelists. So this is a bit of democracy in action to make sure that everyone's voice gets heard, not just those people in the room here. So if you're having any problems, you might want to just lower your firewall settings, because sometimes they can interfere with the access to the VVOX app. So at that point, I just want to introduce the first of our speakers. That's Dr. Andy Reisinger. Andy is a vice chair of the Working Group 3, the mitigation part of the IPCC, and he's had a long history of involvement with the IPCC as a wise voice in the room when it comes to matters of both science and process. Andy is also a commissioner in the New Zealand Climate Change Commission, as well as having a whole range of other roles across the world. And Andy, in spite of the fact that it looks like he's speaking from his hobbit hole, he's actually speaking to us from Germany, where he's resting after a torrid IPCC approval process. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Mark, and good evening, everybody. Yes, indeed, I had great plans to put some slides together that summarize sort of key insights from the report, and I simply find that I have not the energy left after this quite exhausting approval process. So to start off with, I just wanted to run through what for me are some key messages, and I think others will be picked up by other panelists, and I'm sure we can explore various themes as part of the Q&A process. So I guess starting with the bad news side first, we've known this already, but confirmed as bluntly as possible, collective ambition of governments is not measuring up to the collective goal. And without transformative change, this decade, 1.5 degrees is out of reach. So it's no longer 5 minutes to midnight, it is midnight. And I think that's quite an important message. Past IPCC reports have sort of let this slide. And I think we're now at a point where the report says clearly, this window is now closing in our face, which by now means it includes retiring existing fossil fuel infrastructure, cancellation of new coal power plants, and stranding fossil fuel assets if we want to maintain an ambition towards 1.5 degrees. Moving to the good news, and that's really important. One is we have options to halve emissions by 2030, but that means applying all options in all sectors. We can't pick and choose and still have this ambition of halving emissions by 2030. Other good news, climate policy works and we're getting better at it. One key success story in the report is the massive fall in renewable energy and battery costs that now make renewable energy systems cost competitive in many areas with fossil fuel-based systems. And on top of that, the fact that at least 18 countries have achieved sustained emission reductions. So targeted efforts work. We also see more framing legislation that creates a whole package of legislation and regulations towards progress on climate change, and a much wider range of actors, not just at the national level, state, local, and business level. Other insights from the report, climate policy works better as a package to achieve sustained system change. We have many tools in the toolbox and growing experience. We have to use the whole toolbox, not just the Phillips screwdriver, even though it's a fine tool, the Phillips screwdriver, but really have to embrace all the tools at our disposal to achieve the changes necessary. Another major innovation in the report is a dedicated chapter that looks at demand for services as a key framing for what it means to have well-being, rather than energy or material inputs as metrics for well-being. And the important message is that that opens up major options for behavior change. But behavior change is not just individuals choosing to go without, individuals to battling it out on a bicycle in the rain against the wind. It's the insight from the chapter is that it's a combination of infrastructure, technology, and behavior form a package that cuts across climate, urban and rural design, building design, industrial design. So again, a re-emphasis that calls for more integration of climate and non-climate policies that can then achieve 40 to 70% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by enabling such behavioral choices at a wide scale, rather than driving the individual to take their own personal leadership. An important theme in the report that attracted a fair bit of attention is the need to shift and upscale climate financial flows. We have to close the investment gap. Currently, it's a factor of 3 to 6 globally under what's needed by 2030 to finance the transition and transformation we need. But also the more broader recognition that climate change is the result of more than a century of unsustainable development. At the same time, therefore, accelerated action is critical to achieve sustainable development. And again, an important insight that development choices, the way that societies choose to develop, is really important because it can enable or disable more specific climate mitigation choices. It can reduce their cost or it can increase them. If you build suburbs that are connected only by roads, you make it very, very expensive to choose alternative transport means. If you design suburban expansion differently, you open up the space for different entry points for climate policy. So that was a brief, somewhat incoherent rant. I think as a final summary, we know what to do. We know how to do it. It is up to us now, only up to us. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andy, for that introductory presentation and sort of key messages there about policy packages and integration to get effective outcomes. So our next speaker is Professor Tommy Wiedmann. Tommy is a professor in sustainability research. He's at New South Wales University, where he leads the sustainability assessment program. And over to you, Tommy.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction.
I think you're on. Yeah, okay, you're on now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you for the introduction, Mark. Thanks for everyone for attending. As I'm not on campus today, I would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional custodians of the land I am presenting from, which is just west of the Blue Mountains. I'd like to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging. So Andy already summarized the whole report very nicely, and I only want to add one bit of bad news, just one, which I thought was a quite sobering finding, namely that the emissions from existing and planned fossil fuel infrastructure alone are higher than those consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is sometimes called committed emissions or committed carbon, and it is nearly double the remaining carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it's about the same as the carbon budget for limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. So from the infrastructure that we have already planned and that is already existing, we already blow the budget, basically. And it's good to keep this in mind, just what the challenge we are against. But I'm moving on to good news now, and the good news that there is quite a bit. At least 18 countries have sustained greenhouse gas emission reductions for longer than 10 years. And some of them have declined their emissions by 4% per year, which is roughly what we need to do. So some countries are moving in the right direction. And then since 2010, the cost for renewable energy technology has fallen dramatically. Solar power and lithium-ion batteries are both now 85% cheaper, and wind power is 55% cheaper than 10 years ago. The capacity installed has exceeded previous expectations. When we finalized the report last year, we wrote that solar and wind energy provided 7% of total electricity supply, and that has now changed to 10%, which was just announced last week. So as Andy already said, the IPCC report therefore says that greenhouse gas emissions can be halved by 2030, which is what we need to achieve, to achieve the Paris goals. And this can be done with solar and wind replacing fossil fuel energy, with energy efficiency improvements, with reducing demand and consumption, with reducing deforestation, with storing carbon in soils, and also reducing methane emissions. So all of these things have to happen if we want to limit global warming. But there is a significant potential in the near and medium term through changes across transport, industry, buildings, and land use. And this halving of emissions can be achieved at a relatively low cost. That's another really good story or news here. All mitigation options cost less than $100 per ton of CO2 equivalent. And half of them cost even much less, namely $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent. Some deployment even leads to net cost savings. And I just want to very quickly share my screen here just to show you one graph. That is from the SPM, from the Summary for Policymakers. So there is this graph here that shows basically the mitigation options here on the left-hand side by different sectors like energy or agriculture, forestry, and land use, and then the potential to produce the net emissions. So you see here that's in the gigaton range. Just as a reminder, the emissions are currently at 59 gigatons per year, record high. And here we are looking at about 1/10 of that. So there are different options. I just scroll quickly through so you see the legend. We have different sectors here, transport, industry, other. You see that there are mitigation options in all the sectors. And you can see here the cost range in the legend. So blue actually means that the costs are lower than the reference. So if you replace a fossil fuel existing infrastructure with wind and solar, for example, then you gain, the costs are negative. You actually save money. So that's very encouraging. And then we have yellow is below $20 per ton. And so if you just look again through the options here, we see a fair bit of blue and yellow, which means that half of the mitigation options that are listed here are below $20 per ton. So there's a huge potential. Of course, wind and solar are leading, but then we also have carbon sequestration in agriculture, reduce deforestation. So agriculture and land use is a big one, but also industry and all the sectors. So that's just a very quick overview, what can be done. And that's really quite encouraging news. So still the change is not coming fast enough. The report confirms that all the gains that have been made in energy efficiency in the last decade have been more than outpaced by economic growth and population growth, of which economic growth is twice as strong as an upward driver of emissions than population growth. And then finally, just one last point I would like to make is the report also mentions the problem of inequality. Globally, the richest 10% of households contribute about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, while the bottom half contribute less than 15%. And half of all the emissions from aviation are caused by the top 1% alone. So there is a large inequality. And this also leads to the problem of high consumer demand and overconsumption at the higher end of the spectrum. Here, the IPCC report included for the first time a specific chapter on what is called demand-side mitigation, and found that reducing demand and consumption can save between 50 to 70% of emissions in 2050. So there's a massive potential there as well. This includes things like shifting to plant-based diets, active and public transport, less flying, sharing living space and products, but also energy and material efficiency in homes, for example. And I'm sure we will talk about this later. So overall, this latest report from the IPCC reiterates the need for transformational change if the aims of the Paris Agreement are to be achieved, practically in every sector and in every region. Incremental change is just not sufficient. Okay, thank you. That's my intro.
Thanks, Tommy, for that. And our next speaker is Professor Jackie Peel from Melbourne. So Jackie is a professor at Melbourne Law School, and she is a leading expert in terms of environmental and climate change law across the globe. Welcome, Jackie.
Thanks, Mark. And I'm obviously joining you from Melbourne, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking tonight, which is the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Andy and Tommy have given us an excellent introduction to many aspects of the report. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the global policy landscape, which was a particular area that I was contributing on. And I think that policy impacts and policy aspects generally have a strengthened focus in this report, which really reflects, I think, the fact that we're focusing much more on how we increase climate ambition with this particular IPCC working group report. So the first point is to talk about what's changed since the last report, and the key change in the international policy landscape has been the conclusion and coming into force of the Paris Agreement, which we've already referenced. The Paris Agreement is really important for embedding that temperature goal that we're working towards. The report talks quite a lot about the need to stay well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to aim for 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreement also introduces a very different global policy architecture than we previously had under the Kyoto Protocol. So we know that we're not working with a system so much of targets and timetables just for developed countries, which was the framework of the Kyoto Protocol, but looking at universal participation of countries, and with countries required to submit nationally determined contributions to the global response that they're updating on a regular basis. The role of the international in that context is quite different. It's less about dictating targets or setting targets, and more about providing structures for reporting, transparency, and enabling actions by countries. One of the questions that we looked at in the report was, is this framework working? Is it effective to actually produce cooperation to address climate change and bring down emissions? And at this stage, we're really early in the process of seeing whether Paris will work, and the views in the literature didn't come to a consensus. There were differing views. There's a strong view still that without an accountability mechanism at the international level, we may not see sufficient pressure on countries to increase the ambition of their nationally determined contributions over time. On the other hand, there are views in the literature that what we might see over time is the transparency processes, the reporting, helping to shine a spotlight on what countries are doing, and that information can be taken up by a range of actors at different governance levels to take forward action on climate change. There are some positive signs, particularly with COP26, the most recent meeting of countries under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Glasgow last year. It does seem that the policy environment is more favourable towards climate mitigation. We were beginning to see signs of more net zero commitments, and increased ambition from some countries on their 2030 emissions reduction targets. So one of the reasons why this is all very important is because the report finds that international cooperation has an important role to play to support ambitious climate policy goals. And there are a couple of ways in which that works. Andy mentioned previously that finance flows was one of the gaps identified in the report. We know that finance flows are 3 to 6 times below what's needed to achieve the Paris goals in terms of temperature by 2030. How do we fix that? Is probably going to require accelerated international financial cooperation around a range of things. But one thing in particular would be about better assessments and factoring in of climate risks into financial sector decision making and aligning public and private finance flows with the Paris temperature goals. Other areas that were assessed in the report in this respect, the role of international cooperation to help support countries achieve their nationally determined contributions was very important. Developing countries in particular have nationally determined contributions that are pretty much dependent on international cooperation to achieve their full potential. And finally, we see emissions reductions occurring and policies emerging in other different sectoral agreements, particularly international aviation, international shipping, but the level of ambition there is not as much as in other sectors. So there's a clear gap there that needs to be addressed. Finally, just to point out that one of the things that's happening in the international sphere, all the action is not just in the Paris Agreement, it's not just in the international treaty climate regime. There's lots of things happening in many other different fora. So just about all of the policies that's talked about in the report, there's a transnational partnership or institution or framework that exists that's also facilitating cooperation at the international level. I think Xuemei later will talk about the role of cities, and one of the most promising transnational partnership arrangements that has emerged have been the networks of cities that have been very effective, both in advancing ambition by those subnational actors and also in taking forward policies. So I'll stop there, Mark, and look forward to hearing the comments from others.
Thanks very much, Jackie, for that. And whilst we're just introducing the next speaker, if there's people who want to grab a seat, come through, feel free to do that at this point. And I noticed also some comments and questions are coming through on chat. So we won't be addressing questions which come via the chat. So put those questions on VVox, and there's a link in the chat to how to get there. So just use that. Our next speaker is distinguished Professor Xuemei Bai. Xuemei works here at ANU at the Fenner School of Science and Environment and School of Environment and Society, sorry. And Xuemei is a very well-known researcher globally on urban sustainability and policy. Xuemei. Yep.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Mark, for that. Good evening. I'll just follow today's, it seems to be the format, which is starting from the bad news and then shifting to the good news. And then I would like to highlight a bit of, what's really new in terms of urban chapter compared to the last round of IPCC. So the bad news first, we know that about 70% of the global GHG is emitted in cities and urban areas. And that is really huge. And we also know that this share or this amount has actually grown by 5 to 10% during 2015 to 2020. So that's just 5 years time. And we also know that the highest per capita emission usually, typically found in the some of the world wealthiest cities, including Australian cities. But some of the fastest growing per capita is occurring where, the rapid economic growth is happening in the world. And I would also like to really highlight, this is not really mentioned much in many of the media, but really meeting the infrastructure of all these growing cities and then try to provide the same level of infrastructure as we're enjoying in OECD country cities to all these developing country cities would mean a huge amount of embodied carbon. And according to our calculation, that could be up to 226 gigaton of CO2 by 2050. But on the other hand, I think we have to remember that there will be about 3 billion people living in informal areas by 2050. So providing infrastructure to these people will be necessary to begin with. But on the other hand, that also means we really, really need to be able to do that in a really good way so that we don't really lock into a carbon intensive kind of pathway. So come back to Australian cities. I think Australian cities in particular really having it all. We have some of the highest per capita emission in the world, but unlike any other OECD country cities, we're also very rapidly expanding. So that means we have to really excel on all fronts. Like we have to really strive to provide all our energy through renewable sources. And we need to decarbonize our transportation through active transport as well as electric vehicles, which is fueled by renewable energy. And we need to have a better solid waste management, food waste management, etc. And we really, really need to decarbonize our construction sector and pay more attention to the scope 3 emissions, which is, I think in most cases, currently not really in the radar of city government. Even some of the most advanced city government in the world, they're really paying attention to the operational energy use rather than to the embodied energy. And I really like to highlight the importance of paying attention to that. And of course, at the same time, there are huge opportunities because we all know when we wrote the report, we said more than 800 cities in the world have committed to net zero emission. But I think by now it's more than 1,000 cities in the world have already committed to that. And we also know many cities have committed to 100% renewable energy supply. So many things actually are happening in cities. And we know that in addition to the electrifying, through renewables in cities, designing a compact city so that in the first place, we don't have to really generate the kind of carbon through, transportation need is really important. And there are a huge amount of, good examples that are happening there. For example, like Copenhagen, we all know they have this particular, culture of biking, even in the snow or rain, and then having a child in your little trolley. And it all works well, and it doesn't really. I don't think people there really feel their well-being is downsized because of that. And we know that Copenhagen actually reduced about 38 to 43, depending on which year you're talking about, of their CO2 emission compared to 2005, and they are on their way to achieve net zero emission by 2025, which is only 3 years out. So things can really be done if we really mean it, if we really want to do it. And also through our own research, we also know that building more leafy parks and green roofs also really helps in terms of absorbing some of the CO2 emissions we have already emitted from the cities, as well as really alleviating the heat island or extreme heat event, which is expected to be exacerbated. We will be seeing more and more of those in our cities because of the climate change. So these are some of the options that can be adopted by cities. And of course, different measures are suitable for different cities. And for example, like mature cities, you probably would like to do more of a retrofitting of your building and electrify your vehicle suit, and also promote some of the low carbon lifestyles. And for some of the rapidly expanding and growing cities or new cities, I think we should really pay attention to how can we design a city so that we don't really, lock into a carbon intensive urban life or infrastructure, and also try to, electrify our, energy supply, and also try to put in as much as green infrastructure as possible. So there are many, many things cities can do, and many cities are actually doing that. So coming to my last point, I would like to really highlight the urban chapter, this AR6 round, compared to the last round, is that the emphasis on the systems approach. So we really, in this report, we paid particular attention that cities really need to adopt a systems approach, looking at mitigation because the report really showed that cities and urban areas are the place where all of the focus of the 3 working groups, like working group 1, which is looking at the climate change impact, and then working group the science, and then working group 2, which is looking at how to adapt to the change, and the 3, which is looking at the mitigation. But all of these really come together in a city. And I think for the first time in our urban chapter, we have this cross working group box that are replicated in working group 2 urban chapter as well. So in there, we really highlight it is really important looking at mitigation and adaptation together rather than as a separate measure. And also our report also shows that mitigation goals in cities really need to be contextualized within this broader socioeconomic and human well-being context, because our cities really have to serve the functional role of being the economic engine, being the place where people come together, and then a place where can really promote the well-being and health of people. So I'll conclude by saying the cities are really, really the battleground of this of our world towards this, net zero carbon future. And I think Australian cities have a lot to offer in that front.
Thank you, Xuemei. And now we've got our final speaker. So Frank Jotzo is a professor at the ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy. He's also the head of energy at the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. He's a lead author on this report, and he's also on the IPCC synthesis report. So once we've put this one to bed, we're just starting on to the next one, Frank. Isn't that a joyous thought?
we have 2 weeks, don't we, Matt?
Indeed.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. And I'll touch on some of the points that Andy Reisinger made before it bears repeating. It's midnight for 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees, the window for 2 degree outcome is wide open, okay? And in fact, it is more widely open than we thought at the last IPCC assessment report published in 2014. And the reason is that the technological opportunities for zero carbon emissions are far greater now than we imagined they would be 8 years ago. And we know that they are far, far cheaper than really we imagined they could be. And this is, this is not what the IPCC thinks about this. This is what the IPCC assesses the global state of knowledge to be, right? So this is not news. This is just bringing it all together. And of course, it's not a binary choice between 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 3 degrees. There are differences between these different outcomes, and there's a lot of space in terms of likely climatic outcomes between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Where are the opportunities? Well, they're concentrated in energy, in the land sector, but really right across the economy, industry, transport, buildings, urban systems, and of course also the demand side. What about Australia? Well, in Australia, we have all of these emission reduction options in spades, right? In spades. We're a high emissions economy, and we have a practically unlimited potential for relatively low cost, zero carbon energy supply, which can drive electrification, not just in the electricity sector, but through carbon-free electricity in industry, in transport. Emissions are also high in agriculture. That's a question of different processes and product substitution as well. Now, one other thing is carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. A net zero emissions outcome implies that there will remain some positive emission sources, right? Some difficult to abate or costly to abate sectors of the economy. Could be in industry, could be in agriculture, right? And we counterbalance that then by enhanced uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, either through biological means or through chemical means. Okay, once again, Australia would be well placed as a global provider of these kinds of carbon removal services. How do we get there? Well, again, Andy touched on this. Comprehensive policy packages are the key. My own work was concentrated on the on the chapter of policies and institutions, the assessment thereof. And really, this time around in the assessment report, this is overwhelmingly an assessment of actual practical experience, right? Rather than of theory and principle. Okay, that's a decisive difference because the world has in fact implemented very many climate laws, very many climate measures and policies, and the assessed experience with them is almost unambiguously positive. Okay, very many different things have been tried. Almost all of them work. Some work better than others, and certainly they work in harmony. Okay, so that's the idea of a policy package, different types of policy instruments working alongside each other. The empirical experience is that carbon pricing, carbon taxes, emissions trading schemes work really well and have been increasingly refined in their design to meet other objectives, in particular equity and distributional objectives, and that they work in unison with regulatory measures, with subsidy measures, with R&D support, with support for economies or regional communities that may be heavy in fossil fuel-based industries and that may need support in that transition. Final thing I want to emphasize is that this report is very practically oriented and takes a strong lens on sustainability concerns in the developing world, integrating climate change policy with sound development, right? Meeting the broader objectives that governments have in terms of, you know, a better life for our societies, basically, or maintaining quality of life with the climate change challenge, right? This is seen as an integrated package, right? And secondly, the broad involvement right across society, right? This is not just an issue for governments. It's not just an issue for governments and business. This is now understood as an issue for all of societies. Active engagement of NGOs, of grassroots organizations, of the research sector, right? And that is really what constitutes successful climate policy. And very finally, perhaps on the politics of climate change. I've spoken to a lot of journalists in the last couple of days, and one question that often comes is, of course, with regard to the coming election and what will the outcome of the election have on climate change action. And I think, you know, from the bird's eye view that an IPCC assessment report provides us with, the answer is that any particular election should actually not have that much of an influence, should not have that much of an influence on climate policy, because what we really need in order to tackle this properly is a politics that recognizes sound climate policy as a foundational aspect in national policy, just like sound external security policy or sound health policy is a foundation stone of any party's policy platform, right? That's where we need to get with climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. So we're just going to head into just a few questions, facilitated questions. And perhaps leading off from where you were just then, Frank, is we've heard that the need for meaningful and very rapid action is there. The means in many cases are there. So we've got a range of options, but there's a whole range of things which are stopping us. So part of it is the politics, but perhaps if we just go around the panel and get your views on what are the really significant barriers and how to overcome those. And so perhaps we'll start from on the screen with Tommy Wiedmann.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So what are the main barriers that that's preventing us taking change? Now, there's an interesting passage actually in the technical summary, and I would like to read this out. Maybe it's just 3 sentences, but I think it gives us a bit of an insight why we haven't bent the curve yet, because obviously we're going in the wrong direction. Emissions have been increasing, and we know that we need to bend that curve and bring it down. But why is it not happening? So not in the summary for policymakers, but in the technical summary, you will find a bit more information on that, summarized by the IPCC. And I just read out those 3 sentences, and maybe that can also start the discussion then. Obstacles include both entrenched power relations, dominated by vested interests that control and benefit from existing technologies, and governance structures that continue to reproduce unsustainable patterns of production and consumption. Studies also highlight the potential of cultural factors to strongly influence the pace and direction of technological change. Sustainable solutions require adoption and mainstreaming of locally novel technologies that can meet local needs and simultaneously address the SDGs. So this unquote, this was from the technical summary of the report, and I think it points obviously to the power structures, to the vested interests that we know are there from the fossil fuel industry, and that makes it difficult. But it also points out into the direction of where change might occur, and that is at the local level. And a good example maybe for Australia might be local energy communities that do wind or solar energy projects on their own, not waiting for any government to actually go ahead. So that's just one example. I leave it at that because I know everyone else will want to say something on that, but I thought that's interesting to present.
Thanks, Tommy. So maybe Xuemei, so picking up that thread of local action, thinking from urban systems, what do you suggest as a way forward?
Sure. I think for most local government and city government, the first thing you'll hear from them is that we don't really have money because, you know, cities, we live on a small amount of budget and things like that. But I think many of the research actually shows the biggest barrier is not really the financial barrier, but actually the institutional sort of barrier, the mindset of doing things business as usual, and then this very siloed approach that are very prominent in urban, you know, decision making and things like that. And in most of the, you know, really front runner cities, what we can see is that they, you know, try to bring everything down to the, you know, the blank sheet of paper, and then try to see what actually we can do together. So I think what is really important at the city level is try to address this institutional element, and by doing that, you know, trying to develop some sort of innovative mindset, as well as not really afraid to experiment with some of the new solutions and you know, new ways of doing things. And actually, there are many cases that shows if you are willing to experiment in our cities, actually you can find a lot of good you know, solutions to your particular problems. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Xuemei. And thinking at the international level, perhaps Jackie?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I actually wanted to go back to Tommy's point because I think it's worth re-emphasising the extent to which fossil fuels are embedded in our existing structures. So the report points to the amount of existing fossil fuel infrastructure already giving us emissions that will take us past the Paris goal targets. And in terms of that kind of entrenched structures, we've also got not just sort of fossil fuel interests and fossil fuel infrastructure, but the financing system that supports them. And we know that the finance flows in particular are still very much directed and misaligned with Paris goals, so still heavily directed towards fossil fuel projects. And unpacking that really requires some very strong changes in the finance sector, both at the international level, particularly greater cooperation to unlock both public and private financing sources, but also transnational efforts. We've seen, for example, a task force on climate-related financial disclosures, making some progress in terms of setting standards for disclosure that are being taken up globally by different investors and businesses. But transparency might not be enough to really change the system. And it does seem that we're going to need more regulatory activity, which is something that's emphasised in the report, to really change that system. So I think we've got various options in that regard. One that's highlighted in the report is about fossil fuel subsidies that remain in place, and removing those subsidies would be an important action to take to start to unlock some of those inbuilt barriers, if you like, to achieving both greater international cooperation on climate change and policy action at the domestic level.
Thanks, Jackie. Frank?
Yeah, Systems inertia, right? So our systems are heading in one direction, and by and large it's very difficult to turn them around quickly. And as Tommy Wiedmann explained earlier, the identified potential to reduce emissions by 2030, right, is about a quarter of current emissions at costs below $20 a ton. This is not expensive, but don't underestimate just how hard it will be, right? Simply because of the tendency for things to remain the same rather than to change. Right, and one, perhaps the dominant aspect of it is in fact vested interests, right? So whoever owns the the production systems of today will be opposed to a wholesale change unless they have a very profitable business alternative business model, and this is something that very much unfolds in the global car industry at the moment, for example, right? And those existing interests obviously have influence in what is being done in policy as well. I would highlight another factor, and one that is particularly important in lower income countries, but not exclusively. We see that here as well, and that's equity, and in particular the concern of harming lower income parts of our societies, okay? And that is a very, very valid concern, and one concern that we should all have in designing and implementing climate change policy, right? These improvements should not be done on the back of people who are doing it tough, okay? And this comes very much down to a question of policy design and to a question of preparedness, right? Preparedness by governments to actually shift net costs that do occur to some extent to higher income parts of the economy, by and large, kind of people who are in the room here tonight. And avoid imposing additional costs of living on lower income people. And of course, if you're in a low income country, then this very quickly becomes an overriding concern. And there's ways and means of doing that, and I think they will need to be increasingly deployed.
Thanks, Frank. And lastly, Andy.
I'm not sure that I've got all that much more to add to what others have said. Maybe just to point out that a consistent theme in the report is that decision-making processes that involve multiple stakeholders at multiple levels, involve the voices and rights of indigenous peoples, have a much better chance for durable outcomes. But of course, the challenge is these processes take time and require sort of a goodwill commitment to actually engaging in these processes, which in my personal view takes you back to what do you do if vested interests exclude such conversations, and what are the entry points to actually break up such conversations? And I think that's a question of demonstrating change at various levels of scale. One of the issues with climate change still is that it's not in people's faces. I mean, the floods and droughts are in people's faces, but the causality of them isn't. And our emissions are not in our faces, whether it's the emissions associated with power generation or the emissions associated with cars. So I think there is a real value in small scale demonstration projects that demonstrate that taking action on climate change is not doing without something, but actually moving towards something better. It's the mobility provided by electric bikes, which is contingent to some extent on safe bike lanes, rather than battling it out next to the motorway. It's the convenience of well-designed houses where you don't have to worry about your winter energy bill because you don't need much energy to heat them. It's sort of breaking that perception that material resources, either in terms of materials or in terms of energy, are a precondition for a happy, wealthy life with high living standards, and visibly demonstrating the disconnect in that thinking by moving beyond that is I think a powerful tool to signal that there is actually something positive to strive towards and to engage in these conversations. And that combined with financial disclosures where you say, I'm not stupid, why am I leaving my money in that bank if I have any, rather than putting it into a green bond, etc. We've got to talk more about climate change. That's one of the key themes that we're hearing from a lot of people. Make it your everyday topic of conversation, not as a doom and gloom, not as a threat. Make it a team sport. Hey, I've done something. I saw something really exciting today. It was really fun. That's how we should be talking about it. Not, did you know our emissions are the highest in the last decade? it's a good starting point, but it doesn't get you chatting up at the next cocktail party, which is my personal goal.
Thanks, Andy. So I'll just ask one question additionally. So both Frank and you, with your team support analogy, Andy, have raised the sort of the issue about individual action versus essentially policy action. And what I observe and others observe is that at the moment, many of the vested interests are quite happy to push the responsibility and the guilt down on the individuals, and so that they don't have to bear that responsibility themselves. And so perhaps just a few comments on how we can sort of break that sort of trend a little bit and move to something which actually is more effective, the sort of examples that Frank was talking about. So I'll open up to all panelists.
So I think the idea of agency is really important here, from individual to cities and all the way to the national government. I think for individual, the report actually says individual actions are really important because the demand side management has 40 to 70% of potential to reduce the greenhouse emission. But the report also says that individual actions alone is not sufficient in order to realize this kind of potential. And it is very important for cities and national government to put in the structural elements so that make it much easier for individuals to be able to make those low carbon sort of choices. But I think there are more things individuals can do. For example, you can pay a bit more attention to what your cities are doing in terms of low carbon or zero, net zero front. And by doing that, you're generating sort of pressure to your city council or your city government to take action. And actually, we know from examples around the world that if cities also take more actions, for example, like in Korea or like in Japan, most of the cities committed to net zero emission much ahead of their national government. And by having almost all of their major cities committing to net zero, actually that really put pressure to the national government to do the same. And also at the same time, give the national government the confidence that they actually can commit to the net zero. Because if you're, after all, if like 70–80% of your, GDP or your population actually are committing to that, why not? You can just ride on the bus and, it's much easier for the national government to take the action. So I would really like to emphasize the importance of agency, both in individual and city level.
Thanks, Xuemei. Frank.
A nice example where these things come together is how much energy we use in our houses, right? And so that's a function of many things, but let's boil them down to two: size of dwelling and quality of insulation. Okay, so at the one extreme, you've got a very large house that's badly insulated, or a very small house that's really well insulated, right? That's kind of Andy's vision of how we can be happy. And that's actually an important point, because what drives us to have very large houses, right? Average size of new dwellings in Australia, world leading at 200 and something square meters, right? Well, double that of the typical average new European house, okay, or East Asian house. Why is that? Well, because I guess society-wide, we haven't really got that conversation about being able to live happily, perhaps in a smaller dwelling, okay? What about insulation? Okay, well, building codes are really lax, right? We could have much stronger regulation that will actually force better insulation into homes, right? But equally, we could also make that decision ourselves and make that investment ourselves. Why isn't that happening so much? Well, probably because of awareness issues as much as anything else. And once again, I think that comes back to that question of a very broad conversation about these things.
Thanks, Frank.
Maybe could I jump into that as well, just to pick up again on, so chapter 5 of the report really goes into detail of behavioral choices, but more fundamentally how a focus on demand for services can shift the picture, and fully backing up what Xuemei said before. It's the scope for individual behavioral choices to make a huge difference is quite small. And that's exactly where the fallacy and the deeply devious even focus on the personal carbon footprint that can be promoted by large corporates gets you down the wrong space, because what's critical is really the interaction of infrastructure provision and technology provision that allows broad range of choices to be made. So in the chapter, they used what's called the shift, avoid, improve framework. So in the example of transport, shift would be, can you have mobility of a different form? Do you have to drive by car? Is there public transport? Could you use your bike, electric bike, whatever? Avoid means, do you have to travel, or can't you set up a system where you can work from home? And improve is, well, if you have to travel by motorized transport, please choose an electric car. So in that concept, the behavioral choice is a much wider concept than what we often think about in conversations about behaviors. Is like, do you turn the heater down at home? It's a much more systems approach that actually incorporates infrastructure and technology into the suite of behavioral choices. And if done at that scale, and if infrastructure providers have such a goal in mind, you can achieve much wider choice outcomes. So, and that goes into what's called choice architecture, make it available to people rather than make them battle hard for it. Or, simplistically build the bike lanes and they will ride them. Don't build the bike lanes and you will leave it to those who, battle it out next to the motorway. And so that's where a narrow thinking about behavioral choices potentially misses the much bigger picture that's really important. If you have a house that enables you to set the heating cooling point rather than a centrally set air conditioning systems that blows whether you want it or not, it's many of those things where the intersection of architectural design, urban design, industrial design, is it recyclable? Do you have the choice of taking something back? Do you have the choice of using a second-hand material to replace a broken first generation unit in a system? All of these things enable choices to be made by the individual, but without those enabling factors, the individual tends to be quite helpless, and you leave it to quite small piecemeal things, just for us to then point the finger and say, see, you didn't do it anything yourself either, so you're the baddie here. So it's really lifting us up into this much more systemic picture for what allows people to exercise choices.
Thanks very much, Andy. So unless there's vital things you want to add, Jackie and Tommy will move to Q&A, but feel free.
Mark, I just wanted to add one point. I agree with everything that was said there, but just picking up on Xuemei's comment about all of us holding different institutions accountable, whether that's our city governments, whether that's the corporations we're working for, whether it's our university institutions. I think this is really important. Our young people are doing that in spades, and perhaps it's time for some of those who are older and greyer and in positions of power to also be taking that up. So yes, it is a matter of policy, it is a matter of supporting infrastructure, but also these conversations and our own individual advocacy and trying to hold our institutions accountable is important.
Thanks, Jackie.
And I can add a little point here as well. And again, also I agree with everything that was said. And the point I would like to make is that money actually can make a big difference as well. So there's all these activities that we can do to help. But when you look at the total carbon footprint of a person, then it's obviously things like driving a gasoline car and all of that. But it's also the spending, the expenditure, because with every good and service that we buy, we indirectly cause a carbon footprint. And it actually makes up the largest component of everyone's person's individual carbon footprint. So one thing to consider is also, where do we spend our money? How do we invest it? With which bank are we going? Is that bank using my money to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure, for example, or not? Is my superannuation divesting from fossil fuels or not? So these are actually quite important things that individuals can do without, without changing their lifestyle much, because it's just choosing a different bank in that example. So wealthy individuals can act as role models as well, but also in terms of their investment in what they buy. And if you think, well, I'm not really wealthy, then when you look at the global scale, and I said before that 10% of the most wealthy households on the planet create 40% of emissions, then it's actually most of us here in Australia, because at the global scale, if you're above something like $50,000 US or so income, then you are already in that 10% bracket. So that puts us right on the spot there.
Thanks, Tommy. And very soon we'll be able to vote, well, presumably. And so one of the questions here is, if Labor wins, what measures should it take? And if the coalition wins, what do we think it'll do? And what should us as citizens do? So that was a question from Jacqueline. So opening that up to the panel.
Well, it doesn't really matter which party wins if we're asking the question, what should the next government do, right? You know, taking as a starting point that the ambition was to actually, you know, work towards the Paris Agreement kind of globally shared goal of keeping temperatures well below 2 degrees, right? Then for Australia, that translates into getting onto a trajectory to net zero emissions, seriously. And that involves relatively deep emissions reductions by 2030, certainly deeper emission reductions than the global average, both because of the abundant economic opportunity in Australia, we're a high income country, and because of the abundant opportunities to reduce emissions relatively easily in Australia. What do we need for that? Well, we need a comprehensive policy framework to help make that happen, to create the incentives for business, first of all, for investment, but, you know, also for private individuals. And where the incentives don't work so well, for example, in energy efficiency, for example, in advanced technologies where the incremental costs are still relatively high, there, you know, governments need to come in with regulation, with specific support policies. We need a tapestry of policies that work hand in hand, that are comprehensive, and that really drive things in the right directions, rather than sort of a patchwork of policies that by and large work only at very minimal effectiveness and level of ambition.
Mark, if I can just add to that, I absolutely agree with what Frank's saying there, but in terms of the Australian policy landscape, the key gaps really exist at the national level, which is why the federal election is an important point for us to consider here. And in particular, we know that we don't have any national framework legislation on climate change that could provide that kind of long-term planning for how we're going to get to net zero and the pathways for getting there. We don't have good national coordination of processes for just transition, or indeed for policy integration across mitigation and adaptation. We've seen in the IPCC report that many countries have adopted this kind of framework legislation, and it does seem to be effective in helping to reduce emissions. So in terms of a concrete measure that we could be looking for countries to take, including Australia, that would be a key one. And in the international context, Australia at COP26, the Australian government was kind of dragged somewhat reluctantly, it did seem, towards a net zero commitment by 2050. We're hoping that as we head towards COP27 in Egypt, where countries are being asked to strengthen their 2030 targets, review and revisit those, that there could also be increased ambition around our 2030 targets to bring us more into alignment with what's actually necessary to bring about those deep emissions cuts that the IPCC report highlights globally is just so urgent and important.
Thanks, Jackie. you want to follow
Can
up?
I add something? I promise I'll say less down the track. I was thinking that Andy might jump in and refer to the Phillips screwdriver, right? You know, it really is a matter of using all of those tools. You know, in Australia for quite some time, it's been considered that the wrench is absolutely not a tool that is to be used, right? And the wrench is carbon pricing. Yeah, it's a carbon tax or it's an emissions trading scheme. If you're asking, you know, where do we need to get to, then in terms of the national policy discourse, we need to get to a point where we overcome that hang up, right, that hangover over that particular policy instrument. We also need a comprehensive national strategy of how we'll get to net zero and what that means for Australian society and economy, right? We have not got such a thing, right? A document exists late last year that has bears that kind of title, but it doesn't do the job. And part of the reason why it can't do the job is because it was not prepared with comprehensive input from across all the different groups in society that actually have a vital stake in it. And, you know, if we're looking for a reset on climate change, right, then the production of a national strategy, how to get to net zero and have prosperity around it in Australia, and nationally shared strategy would be a really important part of that.
Okay, thanks, Frank. So that's a clear message of what citizens can do, which is what the question particularly wanted to focus on. So I'll just move to the next one, and this is a bit more of a sort of a technical one. So this is from Jack, and he asks, well, given that there's, you know, people often talk about falling prices for batteries and solar PV and wind turbines, does this take into account future issues to do with critical mineral resources and the environmental costs of accessing those? So apparently not.
I've presented those numbers, but I have to be honest that I don't know exactly. Obviously, those estimates come with uncertainties, and they are shown in the graph. And as far as I know, differences in geographical location, for example, and price fluctuations and so on, as far as can be known at this point in time, they have been included. But obviously, there are factors that are beyond assessment, really. Geopolitical tensions, that's one good example, maybe, where we simply don't know what might happen. There is, I know that there have been studies that have looked at the availability of materials. There is some concern with some elements that there might be a bit of a bottleneck. Not particularly that it would limit rapid action, but it depends all on the scale of how much we really need in the future. And so there is some uncertainty, but generally, yeah, all the assessments are based on what we know today.
Thanks, Tommy.
Maybe just to add to that, I mean, the observed declines in cost are simply the observed declines. It's a different question about how much do we think the costs might decline further in the future. And that's where resource constraints are relevant. And to be honest, I'm not convinced that there's always a very thorough assessment being done of especially once you take the cost of environmental destruction from resource extraction into account. But that's why and we're seeing this already with batteries. An increased focus on battery recycling, on circularity is really important to avoid running into those barriers. And the time to set up these more circular systems up is now, rather than when we realize we have a problem. And it's, I mean, you know, every mobile phone, every electric car, we always get very excited about new technology and think about the problems later. And so again, the time to think about it and the time to set systems in place really is now, because that has a much longer term payoff in terms of costs and environmental trade-offs.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. And I noted just in the last week, I think it was GE produced the first fully recyclable wind turbine blade, because previously that was a big issue in terms of recycling those. Did you want to comment any further, Frank? No?
Just sort of a fundamental clarification. All of these cost numbers are essentially focused on the cost relative to carbon dioxide and equivalent emissions, and do not factor in other costs and benefits. So the questions was on the sort of additional costs that might be caused, right? But the other side is, of course, additional benefits that arise, for example, air quality, right? And resultant avoided health costs and so forth, right? So that's really important when we look at any of these numbers that are being presented.
Thanks, Frank. Question for Jackie. This is from Rosalind. You spoke of international accountability, and that's what's required to reduce our emissions substantially. Is there an international accountability framework such as the WTO or even the International Court of Justice? And maybe if there isn't, should there be?
There's certainly international institutions and courts that can hold states accountable for their actions and whether they're in breach of international law. The difficulty at the international level is that all those kinds of mechanisms, perhaps with the exception of the WTO, require countries to actually consent to go before them. So that's why we haven't seen a lot of international litigation before courts like the International Court of Justice, even though there might be a good case at international law to hold particular countries accountable for their larger contribution to the climate change problem. In the WTO context, that's our institution that looks after international trade. It has had a number of disputes come before it that raise questions around trade measures that are also trying to achieve environmental goals. One of the big questions that's unanswered is what would happen if countries took trade measures to try and implement climate policies. For example, the European Union has talked about imposing essentially carbon tariffs on countries like Australia, where we're not taking sufficient action to reduce emissions domestically. And we haven't seen that kind of case yet. It's not quite certain whether the result would be actually to uphold those climate policies or to say that the trade impacts make them illegal under WTO law. So in answer to the question, we're not really seeing those international accountability mechanisms functioning to hold countries accountable on their individual contributions to climate change. In the international space, the activity is really around global collective action and the international cooperation processes like the Global Conference of the Parties, where countries come together and have to account to each other about the actions that they've taken to address emissions and climate change.
Thanks, Jackie. So I'm just selecting questions which are suitable to the panel to answer. There's a question here which is, how can Australia wind down its coal exports without disrupting the economy? That's from Paul. Anyone want to pick up that core transition issue? That's okay. Just do it briefly. Yeah.
Well, there's some interesting numbers in the report, and I haven't got them in front of me, but for 2-degree outcome, the global use of fossil fuels will dramatically decline. And that is with the assumption of widespread availability of carbon capture and storage. If CCS is not so available, then the decline is even more. So from memory, the numbers for coal are, maybe Andy can correct me or Tommy, 60 to 95% by 2050. And so that spells the end of Australia's coal export industry. And that is a very significant adjustment process, right? For shareholders, very much so. But importantly for local communities, regional economies, in fact, right? And we need to recognize that, and we need to plan for that, and we need to care for that. Overall, in macroeconomic terms, that's actually not so big a problem because there's plenty of other mining related and heavy industry related activities that will be absolutely in the ascendancy, and that Australia can be a very suitable location for, right? So including for export in terms of carbon-free products and commodities that can, and energy carriers that can be produced in Australia and exported. But the issue really is in the transition process in these particular areas. You know, there's high-paying jobs attached to them, and they're locally concentrated issues, in particular Central Queensland, Hunter, and to an extent the Latrobe Valley. And yeah, that will need to be a managed transition, and whether or not that transition happens is very largely out of our hands in any case. It comes to us, and we'll need to deal with it.
Thanks, Frank. So question for Xuemei. So the question is from Tamara, and it is, how much of an impact could greening cities and towns and taking measures like restoring mangrove forests have on Australia's climate efforts? So while you're picking up the microphone, people often talk about restoring mangrove forests and seagrass and salt marshes, and those can be locally very important. The IPCC Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere did an assessment of how much that potential is, and the answer was 0.05% of our current greenhouse gas emissions. And so whilst it can make a contribution, it is a small contribution, even though we might argue that there's lots of co-benefits that make it desirable to do. We need to recognise that there is no single silver bullet, whether it's blue carbon or anything else. We have to have a portfolio of approaches.
Yeah, I think, Mark, you have actually answered the whole question. Okay. So there are some studies looking at what is the carbon sequestration potential of having a bit more trees or parks. And the result is very small. And actually, there was a study in Spain a couple of years ago looking at managing a national park in an urban context. And then they found that actually the energy that are used to run the park, like, you know, the transportation and everything else, actually exceed the carbon sequestration potential. But the point exactly is not on how much absolute amount of carbon that you can actually sequestrate by using this sort of green and things like that. The point is exactly on the co-benefit. And the importance, in particular in the climate change context, is that the need to adapt to climate change impact. For example, you know, our study really shows, like even in Melbourne, where we have quite a lot of green, having additional green, you know, tree canopy or green roof, that actually really helps in terms of alleviating the heat stress in a extreme heat event. So it is really important that we have that. And on the other hand, not on the other hand, in addition to that, I think it's very important to have that sort of mindset to look at what are the potentials of doing this carbon sequestration in cities. For example, trees are not the only one, but also, you know, can we use actually some of the wood structure to build our low or mid-rising or even high-rising buildings? And it is experimented in different parts of the cities, like in Tokyo. They can build like 10 stories high-rising building using wood structure. And last year there were several new studies that actually shows if you replace some of our cement or concrete sort of structured building using wood structure, that can actually significantly replace some of the carbon emission. So I think that sort of mindset, trying to explore the potential, that's probably is more important than the absolute numbers.
Thanks, Xuemei. So I'll move to the next question by Anthony, which is, how dependent are we on hydropower and green hydrogen for 1.5 degrees to be possible? And he asks because both are dependent on effective and sustainable water management, which can't be assumed in most countries. And clearly there's an existing development path which causes competition for water, but also climate change is going to increase that in many places. So how dependent are we on those things to get to 1.5?
I'll just fill the void by just briefly clarifying on hydrogen, right? So hydrogen by electrolysis uses a really small amount of water relative to the energy converted, okay? And that amount of energy is so small that you can even draw the water from seawater through electric-based desalination and not make too much of a dent in the energy balance from it. So water availability for green hydrogen production is not the bottleneck.
Thanks, Frank. So I'll just jump down the list here a little bit. And in the summary for policymakers in the report, it reports 18 countries have reduced their emissions. Tell us a little bit about what we've learnt from those 18 countries.
I can maybe jump in here. So the report looked at emissions from countries on two different perspectives, production-based and consumption-based. And on the production side, what could be seen is that those countries that reduced emissions, there are a couple of factors that played a role. One is renewable energy, so decarbonization of the electricity system. That was one factor, but also a shift in fossil fuels away from coal towards gas. So in particular, North America had that shift where they ramped down coal power, but increased it with a lot of gas, mostly produced from national sources through fracking. And that increased a lot 10, 20 years ago. And that really made a difference simply because of the shifting of the fuel. Energy efficiency is another factor that helped reduce emissions. In many cases, this has been counteracted by economic growth, but for those countries that managed to reduce emissions, they made it in, the economic growth was not that driving factor. So mostly these were developed countries where economic growth is not as high as, for example, in East Asia. So we are not talking about 6 to 10%. We are talking more about 0 to 2% or so. And then it's easier to reap the gains from energy efficiency. So those factors together that reduced emissions, but they are all together, they are not sufficient. They have not really made a big dent. They have slowed down the growth of global emissions. In the last 10 years, that growth was 1.3% per year, whereas in the decade before it was 2% per year. So I don't know whether that counts as good news, but a slow in the growth of emissions, but still a growth in emissions. So it's still not enough. Still more needs to be done, in particular renewable energy.
Thanks, Tommy. So we're heading towards the last questions. There's a question about circular economy, and I'll just reframe it a little bit. So if you go to the EU, circular economy is a really big policy issue, and it's being implemented in a whole range of ways, and there's a series of subsidiary policies, including the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms to assist that to happen. In Australia, it's not even part of our discourse. Like we virtually never mention it. How can we actually get this as part of the way we think and talk and act in Australia?
Again, I can say a little bit about that, maybe, because I'm involved a little bit in New South Wales Circular, which is a body that has been set up to promote the circular economy in New South Wales. But there are others in other states as well. There's also the Australian Circular Economy Hub, which is run by Planet Arc, and with federal government funding. So there are initiatives to bring this along. And the circular economy has a big potential. Obviously, we in terms of waste, there's definitely a lot we have to catch up. So if you compare Australia and Europe, then there is 20, 30 years of difference between them. And there is a lot to catch up. But one thing that I always say when it comes to circular economy, the circular economy can only work if the linear economy is scaled down at the same time. You cannot have both coexisting, because the linear economy will always win. It's by definition almost cheaper to just take something from the environment, make something, and then dispose of it, if there is no internalization of external costs. If there is an internalization of external costs, then that's different, of course. But that needs regulation, and that's not happening to an extent that would be sufficient. So there needs to be at least either economic incentives or policies that actually scale down the linear economy and actively promote the circular economy, and then it can work. It has been shown to be able to make significant contributions to mitigation, especially in the industry sector.
Thanks, Tommy. So we've got 3 minutes to go, and I just want to finish on time. So can I get from each of the panelists a quick statement, 30 seconds or less, about what you think are the most important take-home messages for people to leave this meeting with? And perhaps we start with Jackie.
I can imagine what some of the other messages are that people are going to highlight, so I'm going to try and go for something a bit different, Mark, which is that's been alluded to a little bit already. But the report does draw attention to the fact that equity and justice concerns are really salient, not just to ensuring social acceptance of policies around climate mitigation, but in fact to making them more effective. And I think that that's particularly important in a global context where there are significant inequities between countries in terms of their opportunities for climate mitigation. So I just call attention to those aspects as a really important part of what we need to be addressing in our efforts to bring down emissions.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Tommy, 30 seconds or less.
Yes, I liked Andy's phrase that we are at 12 o'clock. I think we have left it too late. Let's not leave it even later. We now have an opportunity to catch up, and I think we really need to go for this because we already know with 1.1 degrees of warming how bad it is. Let's not make it worse.
Thanks, Tommy. Xuemei. Oh, sorry, we'll do Frank first and then continue. So,
yeah.
Oh,
so
Andy.
the key thing is this is no longer hypothetical, right? This is no longer a question of what we could do, right? This is a question of evaluating what we are doing and how we can greatly speed it up and deepen the action to reduce emissions.
Thanks, Xuemei.
I think to me, cities are really the battleground, the front line of these things whole. And I think Australian cities, we have long been really topping the chart of livability in the world, and we have been the envy of the world. And I think now it's really time for Australian cities to step up and then try to chart the way and then lead the charge towards the low carbon. And I think we do have the potential to do that.
Fantastic. And Andy, and the answer is not live like hobbits. So
who knows? I think it's simply that the time for action is now. We have all the tools in front of us, laid out, described, worked through. Let's get on with it. There's no reason not to.
Thanks very much, Andy. So just to wrap up, I'd just like to say, I think we've heard a range of really great questions and some fantastic views expressed here. And I want to thank all of the panelists. I want to thank Melbourne Climate Futures for co-hosting this with us. And I'd also particularly like to thank Michelle and Renee for organising this. This is Renee's first meeting that she's organised for with us, because she's just come on board just within last week or two. And I hope you all have a great night and you go home and take action. Thank you very much.